Hello, hello, everyone. I am Tamika Edwards, and I have the honor and pleasure of being here today with tonight's guest, Mr. Matthew Van Meter. Mr. Van Meter is a journalist, an author, and a prison theater facilitator, and he's based in Detroit. In addition to his deep Delta justice, his writing about criminal justice has appeared in The Atlantic and The New Republic. He also teaches at the College for Creative Studies and the university in the University Legit School. I think I said that correctly. I got all my
Yeah.
words mixed up. And he is the assistant director of Shakespeare in Prison. So we'll probably want to hear just a tiny bit of that Shakespeare in Prison if we have enough time toward the end. So I will tell you that this book helped me to really understand my love for nonfiction. This is an amazing book. And if you all have not picked up your copy yet, you are in for a treat. The way it is written brings all types of images and thoughts, and I found myself being able to read several pages in an evening because it's just so interesting. So, welcome, Matthew, and thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks so much, Tamika. It's a pleasure.
Good. And thank you, of course, to the Central Arkansas Library System. We are so grateful to them for bringing this tonight. And be sure, if you're watching, to include any questions that you may have in the chat. We will have time to answer those questions. But it's 6:32 and you're not here for me, so let's get to it. So I know, Matthew, that a lot of people are probably wondering why this book? How did you even get to this point? I know some of the notes in there even talk about you talking with folks as far back as 2015. So why Deep Delta Justice?
Yeah. I mean, I stumbled into the story. I was reporting on criminal justice when I was in graduate school, getting an MFA at Columbia University in New York City. And I was interviewing all of these lawyers. So I took a law school class while I was there, a criminal procedure class. And one of the cases that was covered was Duncan versus Louisiana, which is the basis of the book. And I just I thought it was a great story. You know, this 19-year-old black tugboat captain shrimper from Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, which at the time was ruled with an iron fist by one of the most powerful segregationists in the South. You know, and he gets arrested for touching a white kid on the arm, trying to break up a fight, and his lawyer Richard Sobol, um, who helped him fight that case all the way to the Supreme Court and really took on the power structure that had defined the place of Gary Duncan's birth and upbringing, and really put a crack in that system in so doing. And so I thought it was a pretty great story, and I went to look up who wrote the book about it, because surely somebody had written a book about such a good story and an important moment in American legal history and in the civil rights movement. And no one had. That was in March of 2015, and I pretty much dropped everything and started work on the book right about that.
That's amazing. I mean, so you just dropped it all and you said, hey, I'm going to figure out this story and I'm writing about it.
I think I called my then wife that evening and said I've got it. I think I know what I'm going to do. I think she told me to cool it, but which is the right thing to say. But I did. There was something about that story that I knew. Like there were a lot of times in writing it when I doubted my own ability to
Mhm,
pull off
mhm,
the task. There were a lot of things about it that were daunting, but I never doubted the story for a second.
mhm. And I'm glad that you went with that desire to move forward because it is, as you said, an amazing piece of American history, especially thinking about the various laws that were implemented, but the impact that it had on criminal trials and what was happening in Louisiana. And so we both know that Mr. Sobel passed away this year. And I think it was in a New York Times article where in April of this year, where they talked about your book and said that for so many years he was not known, but many people will know exactly who he is
Yeah.
once reading this book. And I'm glad that I had the opportunity to read it and having the opportunity to even talk with you right now. So for 5 years, you went on this journey in writing this book. How many folks did you interview?
Gosh, I don't know. There's a full list towards the back of the book. At some point, I lost count. I mean, it was many dozens. And some of that was, I mean, I spent a lot of time with Richard Sobol, and especially a lot of time with Gary Duncan and his
Yeah.
family, because it's a world that's really foreign to me. And I, as a journalist and just as a person, like I tread very carefully when I go into places that I don't know, you know. And I'm a northern boy. I'm a Yankee. I moved around a lot, but I grew up in New England and the Mid-Atlantic. I live in Michigan. And I'd never been to the Deep South, let alone Louisiana or the New Orleans area until I started reporting this book. And so I went down over, and I think I made 18 trips over the course of those years down there, and really immersed myself as much as I could in the community, and spent as much time as I could with Gary and his family, and you know, ended up becoming pretty good friends with Gary, and go into his church, and really to understand the his life and his view of his life, not just mine, right? Because I don't know anything. And then for the other folks, I mean, I think it was really important for me that there was, as well documented as Plaquemines Parish was, because of Leander Perez, who was this sort of larger than life, bombastic, you know, racist figure for much of his political career. There was very little documentation, formal documentation of the Black communities down the road. And so for example, when I went to to write the chapters about school desegregation, which, as you know, form a major subplot of the book, both because they're emblematic of the way that desegregation went across the South, which is not a story we teach very well in history classes for the most part, but also because Plaquemines Parish had a unique position because of Leander Perez in the history of school desegregation. And as a storyteller, I turned that into, I hope, a sort of, you know, page turning experience, but there was very little documentation. That there was no oral history. I feel safe saying there is no oral history, except for the recordings I have on my computer of what it was like to be a student in the classes that were desegregating those schools, both white and Black. And I talked to dozens of people who were in those classes because I needed to know what that was like, because I have no idea, right? And so I had to sort of create the oral history archive I wish existed in order to write those chapters. And so I ended up talking to a lot of people in that regard, and also in terms of these lawyers, right? There were these, you know, in order to enact and really force the South to comply with the civil rights mandates handed down by the federal government. These were not self-enforcing laws. You needed, you know, at times hundreds of lawyers to file thousands and thousands of lawsuits all over the South, because, you know, they, for the most part, you know, municipalities just ignored the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, the Supreme Court cases about desegregation. And so you needed people like Richard Sobol, and I had no idea about this history, right? And so I ended up interviewing a lot of the lawyers who went down as well, because their story is really important. And so that was, you know, the core of the book are these really, you know, these long, over many years, rich interviews, particularly with Richard Sobol and particularly with Gary Duncan and his family. And then the rest of them were so that I could flesh out a history that unfortunately is quickly passing from living memory, and that for the most part has not been documented for a general audience very well at all.
So once you started gathering the information, when did you in earnest start writing the book?
It was ongoing. The first couple of chapters, which were not the first in chronological order, but the first ones I felt comfortable writing. I think I started about 6 months after I began research on the book, and I had I still had a year left in my MFA creative writing program, that gave me the time and space and sort of mentorship to do that. But I didn't really start going in earnest um, until a couple of years in. I think I had written about a third, maybe less, maybe a quarter of the book. The chapters that were sort of low hanging fruit that I feel like I could understand on my own, the ones about Perez, the ones about school desegregation. The other ones that required more of what novelists call interiority, that kind of inner life of the characters, like that takes years of talking to someone to get right. And so I didn't feel comfortable writing much of Gary's perspective at all until I really felt like I knew the guy. And but then once I started writing those, I mean, this was just about two years ago in the summer. I was around this time. It was just sort of like flowing out of me because I had done the groundwork to do it.
So what's interesting, I think, is that while this is nonfiction, even just in reading it, you were able to capture so many details that I thought, did he take a journalistic license in order to get this out? Even in commenting how people looked at their shoes or how things were simple, or even in the beginning, just outlining the storm and what Gary went through when he went back to his car from the levee. So how did you create those images?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think that's, for me as a journalist, like those are the things that I really care about. I mean, I care about getting the names and the dates and all of the details right and verified. And I will go to great, sometimes unreasonable lengths to do so because that's my job. But as a journalist and as a person, I care most about the inner lives of the people who are living through the stories I'm telling. And so for me, what was important was going back, particularly with Gary, going back again and again and getting him to tell the same story over and over again until I felt like I had it in my bones, and then writing it out. And this is something I do because I don't have any formal journalistic training. I didn't go to journalism school. I went to art school. I've never worked as a newspaper reporter, sort of self-taught. And what I when I was going to the fact checking phase after I was done with the first draft of the manuscript, I couldn't think how to fact check the inner thoughts of someone except to read aloud to them from the manuscript. And to me, that was so important because not only would I mean, I felt more comfortable when someone said, "Yes, that's just how it was. You got it." But people would remember events that they wouldn't or details that they wouldn't remember otherwise. But something happens when you hear your story as a story that brings up other memories for you. And so you mentioned the detail about Gary with the eye of the storm passing over him. He told me that story a dozen times from the beginning of the storm to the end of the storm, and I kept taking notes and I kept recording it. And it wasn't until I went back to him and read that entire chapter from beginning to end to him that he said, "Oh yeah, but then this other thing happened," and it was the most. I mean, it's this high moment of high drama that he had glossed over because it was traumatic for him, and he doesn't. He's sort of allowed that to slip away from the rote way that he tells that story. But hearing it as a story, right, something in his mind clicked and said, "Wait, there's a missing piece here." Right, and that happens so many times with so many people over the course of reporting the book and fact checking the book. And it was also really important for me, especially as a journalist, and also just as a person, to, particularly when writing about the lives of people whose life experiences are so profoundly different from mine, never to assume that I get it until they have told me that what was on the page is what their experience was, because I don't get to define what that meaning is, right? They define it. I tell the story, but they define what the moment in their lives meant to them.
So I'll include a couple of the questions that we have coming in the chat, just because I
Right.
know I will hog a lot of time because this is so interesting to me, but I want to be sure that we have folks who are watching and have some questions. So Bonnie asks, what was the reaction to the book from the locals in Louisiana?
Good, I mean, good question. I mean, actually don't, and this is one of these unfortunate things about the era we're living in. I haven't been able to make it down there for months, and certainly not since the book came out a couple of weeks ago. So I mean, other than talking to folks on the phone, I mean, I know that it's come up. Gary's church, Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church, is doing Facebook Live Bible studies, and it's come up, and they've had a really positive. I've gotten some wonderful notes from friends down there, but without actually being there, I don't entirely know. In terms of their reaction to my reporting the book,
Mhm.
people were really um, quite open to it in general. I think there were a lot of folks who, for various reasons, were skeptical of me at the beginning, which
Right,
is fair. I would have been skeptical of me too, and Gary is one of those people.
right.
It took me a while to convince him that I was not just there to kind of take his story and run.
Mm.
Um, but generally speaking, I was really people mostly like talking about themselves, and this is such ancient history for a lot of folks that it is it was in a lot of ways for people it was reliving times that, even if they weren't necessarily good, if they were painful times, it was still remembering a time in their lives that was exciting in a way. And so people were pretty eager to talk, and I'm really grateful for that.
So now here's a question that I've been really thinking about, because many of the issues that you bring out in the book, they just seem to mirror the times that we're living in right now. I remember just reading about the march and the anxiety and the thoughts and the planning that went behind it. And so Courtney asks, some of the issues addressed in the book from the 1960s are still very prevalent today. How did you feel writing this book, exposing those truths and problems from the 60s, and then just realizing how much they are the same today?
Geez, yeah. I mean, I used to joke kind of somewhat morbidly that the biggest occupational hazard I had was deja vu. I mean, these are the questions that have been around. It's not just the '60s, right? These are the questions that we've been wrestling with as a nation for a long time, still are wrestling with, obviously. And there were so many, just reading newspapers, right? Which is a big thing I do, is sort of reading daily newspapers in a various city, just to get a sense of what was on people's minds, and reading the New Orleans Times Picayune for just kind of going through it for much of the '60s. Just I mean, a lot of it seemed dated, and a lot of it seemed like it could have been ahead. They were talking about the same stuff, right? It could have been from today. They were talking about stop and frisk. They were talking about the relationship between the police and the communities of color in the city. They were talking about you name it. I mean, all the things that we talk about now, really. And particular, and it was one of the things that really drew me to the story, of course, was how many points of contact there were between the 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 story itself. And I got interested in it because of the criminal justice angle, and because of the importance of the Supreme Court case. What I ended up finding not more interesting necessarily, but that I wasn't expecting, was that this was also about what we want our schools to look like. It was about what who really has the right to vote in this country, and what do we have to do to protect that. It was about what do you do when the what do you do when the legal systems and the legal structures and the lawyers in a place are not fulfilling their constitutional obligations. And it was part of, I felt like my journey on writing the book is very much the way that the story of the book goes, which it starts out as this really little thing, right? A 19-year-old guy touches a kid on the shoulder as a way of being like, okay, break it up now. And all of a sudden it starts snowballing and escalating on both sides. Um, and next thing you know, you're in the Supreme Court, and it's issues with the United States Constitution. It becomes this whole big deal, right? And that was sort of how it started with me, where it was this nugget of these three characters, right? And this little story that wound up in the Supreme Court. And then within within the first couple of days of my first reporting trip down to New Orleans, I remember being like, this story's way bigger than that. That's the main thread, right? But the story has points of contact with other issues, all of which are still super relevant today. And that's when I realized I had my work cut out for me, but also that I was the more I learned, the more interested I was by the story, and the more excited I was by the story.
And that's one of the things that I noticed, and I'm glad that you brought it up at this point, was just the beginning. And I remember reading through and imagining Gary's hand on Landry's elbow, you know, and thinking to myself, Gary, why did you even stop the car? You should have just kept driving where you were supposed to be going. But then the image of the teacher looking, and I knew at that moment that it was going to go, you know, downhill. But I think you did a really good job of weaving in what the core issue was. So, which leads me to this Perez fella, right? So I just kept thinking to myself, oh my goodness, this Leander Perez, this Judge Perez. And he was just a symbol of what happens when power goes unchecked, right? But as you were reading through and taking, you know, reading through the paper, talking with individuals, you know, and even just looking at this of how Leander was, what were your feelings as you were writing about him and just reading even more about Perez?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to your earlier point, I think I have to mention that that was when Gary knew that something was off too. Was it was not four white kids and two black kids on the side of the road. That was like a little troubling. There was relatives. It was that there were white men watching from the other side of the road, and and because I have the limitations of my life experience, it took me a long time to hear what he was saying when he said that. Um, and so it was really I'm really glad that you picked up on that, and I hope that that is something that comes through to all readers, and not just readers who have to think about that a lot. In terms of Leander Perez, I mean, he's as a writer, he's a great, uh, he's a great villain. He's almost too good. And that chapter really, the second chapter, the one that's his biography, um, just my editor knows how many drafts of that I went through because there's too much, right? His story is just, and he said too many provocative things, and ultimately what I found was, for me, when I cut through, I mean, hundreds and hundreds of pages I've written about this guy and trying to get at the nugget of it, and he's just there's too much good stuff about him, right? And by good I mean shocking, um, uh, but also a really mixed figure, right? He was incredibly helpful in the development of the parish in a lot of ways, in ways that really hurt the Black community, and also in ways that helped it, which I can talk about later. But for me, the most important thing about Leander Perez was that I realized that I had been getting uh, distracted from what was really monstrous about him by all of the things that he said. And it was listening to people over and over again in Plaquemines Parish, um, where white folks in Plaquemines who lived under Perez tend to remember. Nobody is openly pro Perez down there, almost nobody, or nobody I talked to. But white folks tend to remember the really shockingly racist things that he said, um, and condemn those. And black folks in Plaquemines Parish tend to remember the policies he enacted that were denying them their rights. And they don't really mention the shocking things that he said, because those were less, frankly, had less effect on their lives. And that, like, to me, that would, I'm a slow learner, but I do learn. And that when that dawned on me, I was like, oh, like, I don't have to provide a laundry list of every shocking thing this guy said. It's not about that, right? It's about power, and it's about the institution that he created, right? And he's telegenic as a racist, as a bombastic, whatever. But But that was not the core of his evil, right? Like whatever was evil about Leander Perez had to do with the laws that he wrote behind closed doors, right? That's what oppression looks like. It's not somebody getting up and giving some speech, right? There's damage that's done by that for sure, but it was the backroom dealing that was keeping the boot on the neck of Gary Duncan's family and community, right? Not some guy spouting off. But he used the spouting off, and I think this is something that we see again now and have always seen. The spouting off, the racist, the language, the attention-getting, headline-grabbing language that he used was was a distraction. I think he very much knew what he was doing. It was a distraction from the actual work that he was doing, because at the end of the day, right, the newspapermen went to write their headlines about all the racist stuff Leander Perez said, and Perez went home to write more laws that made up the system we call Jim Crow.
And that's the one thing that stuck out to me so much, was just how intricate his policy schemes were, in saying, hey, I'm doing all this good, but then putting law after law after law in place and wielding so much power. And even still, just reading through, I still had trouble of how he was able to garner so much power, even while just offending everyone, but he was still able to get so much power. So, how do you describe how he was able to land so much power and have so much influence?
Well, that's the trick of it, right? Is he offended all of these people, but he did provide for the people in his parish. And I will say this, that in Plaquemines Parish, black and white people who lived under Perez remember that he had a mixed legacy. And so there were, for example, college scholarships that were available to any college, in-state college-bound person from Plaquemines Parish who graduated from Plaquemines Parish High School. That was regardless of race, and it's not like they gave black kids less money. But that, because that wasn't about disrupting the social order of Plaquemines Parish, which was deeply white supremacist, and so that was about helping someone out, and so he would do that. Right. And so there were, and a lot of people will say, black and white, that the most important thing that he did in Plaquemines Parish for the people was to force the oil companies, and this is seems like such a nitty gritty little detail. We forced the oil companies to work a 5 and 2 schedule, 5 days on, 2 days off, a regular work week. They don't work like that today. And mostly they didn't like working like that before, because if you work 21 and 7, right? 3 weeks on, 1 week off, then people could live all over the Gulf South and commute to Plaquemines Parish to head off to the rigs. And Perez said, no, I want them here. I want them in our schools. I want them paying local taxes. I want them going to local churches, right? Black, white, whatever, right? And by forcing the oil companies to really strong arming the oil companies in bullying them into doing this thing that was good for the parish, he enriched the parish, right? And people remember that, and they remember his legacy as mixed, even though most people, and particularly folks in the black community, remember much more strongly the really oppressive things that he did. But he would throw these scraps to people, right? While enriching himself, while enriching the parish as a whole. And people gave them their loyalty because he provided a certain type of white people, that is, he provided a certain type of stability. And there were always, anti-Perez agitators, but he wielded so much power, particularly in the role as prosecutor, that it wasn't much worth challenging him. And folks in Plaquemines Parish were generally better off than other folks in the rural South, because there was so much between the oil work and shrimping and fishing and oyster, and there was citrus. I mean, there were so many ways to make money down there that people were not desperate, white or black, in the same way that they were in much of the rural Gulf South. And so there was a certain amount on the side of the white community, complacency, and certainly a lot of fear in the black community that kept people from attempting to vote him out. And not that necessarily would have worked, but it's seductive, I think, to have that to have a certain degree of comfort. And whites were always a majority in Plaquemines Parish, and that's all he ever needed. He didn't actually need to suppress the black vote, of course, is the irony of it, right? It's not, black people have never been more than 35% of Plaquemines Parish, right? So even if he lost every single black vote, if every single black voter registered, he still would have won. So that was about like power and just straight up big, just being a bigot. But and wanting to have an overwhelming victory when a regular victory would have been just fine. But he has this mixed legacy in Plaquemines Parish, which is one of the most interesting things about him. But again, all of that obscures the root of it, which is that he was a diligent, brilliant creator of the system we now know as Jim Crow.
So I'm going to shift just a bit to capture a question where it says, Brad says, with all the books, vivid drama, and your background in theater, any thoughts on adapting it for the stage?
For the stage, I never thought about for the stage. Maybe when we can have nice things like live theater again. Alas, I was actually working front of house at a show here in Detroit at Detroit Public Theater right before the quarantine and everything, which is a shame. I will say, so there is a documentary that's being made by Nancy Bursky, who's an award-winning filmmaker. She made the story of Loving, which the movie Loving was based on, and more recently the rape of Recy Taylor, and that's been wonderful. And she and I have a really great relationship. It's called A Crime on the Bayou, so look out for it whenever it comes out. But of course that's a documentary, right? So not quite in the playwriting vein. Obviously the story is sort of cinematic, and I'll say the one thing I'll say about that in terms of my background in theater is, a lot of people who write about the legal system sort of shy away from courtroom scenes. I mean, they're just so the lawyers in the audience, I'm sure there are some, will know that actual courtroom dialogue is just dead boring. It's so dull. I've sat through a lot of actual trials and hearings just with the work I do. So, but for me, I took on that as a challenge. Right? It's so rare as a writer of history or a historian, you get to have like certified or certifiable verbatim dialogue from the past, right? But I've got still 25,000 pages of transcripts and court documents from these cases, and it's great. And I look at that. And I say to myself, like, okay, like I'm a writer of dialogue. The first things I wrote were plays, and none of them got published. But like, I've got this is my value added, right? I get all excited about it. Those are the most fun chapters to write. We're taking, this mess of a transcript, all, filled with jargon and legalese and, whatever, false starts and stuff, and editing it into like a chapter's worth of propulsive dialogue. And I love that. I would do, like, if I could do that for a living all day, I'd do that all day.
So we'll shift back to the book. So Judy asked that she was really interested in Richard's motivation and personal decisions to become a civil rights attorney. And that intrigued me as well, because, it's like he was living the secret life when he was at the law firm, but really wanted to get into it, but didn't have that connection. And it seemed as though it was like, oh, I'll just take some vacation days and I'll go do this. And then, I'll come back. But once he got there, he bit the bug. So she asks, how much time were you able to spend with him in talking about his story?
Yeah. So Richard was the first person I contacted because I knew I would need to be able to talk to him and to Gary at the very least in order to write the book. So since I was at Columbia, I had no idea how to contact this guy, right? And not like journalists have some special book where they can look up everyone. So I wrote him a letter and took a blank envelope with a stamp on it to the Columbia alumni office. And I said, listen, I know you can't give out addresses, but I also know you're really good at tracking people down. So I was like, if I give this to you and tell you to send it to Richard Sobol, will you? And they did. And he wrote back. And so we had this in 2015. And so he and I had a number of, that first year, really dense, rich, wide-ranging interviews, mostly over the phone, but also one at his home in Northern California. Um, and, uh, and then he his health started to fail a little bit, and we were mostly out of touch during the sort of middle period of writing the book. But I kept going back to those. It was like 6 hours altogether of interview with him, which is not in the grand scheme of things a whole lot. Although I had some later with him, but they were so dense and so rich. And the more I learned from those interviews, and I listened to them over and over and over again, and things started to click into place every time I listened to them. And I had initially, when he stopped talking to me back in 2016, I'd initially sort of despaired a little bit, right? As a journalist, you never want one of your sources to stop talking to you. But I realized that everything I needed to write his part of the book was in those interviews, that they were so dense and specific and full of all the right type of information for almost any avenue I could imagine for going in the writing of the book, that I mostly didn't. It would have been nice to have those conversations with him, but he was dealing with a lot of stuff on his own, and I was so grateful, and like increasingly grateful as the years went on, for those 6 hours of initial interviews with him. So that was, and close readers of the book will see how much I cite them. I mean, it was really a gift. And then I had the opportunity twice in the last year to read portions of the book aloud to him at home, shortly before he passed away. Although I didn't know that at the time, of course. And that was really rich in a very different way. His memory was not as good, but he remembered different things. He remembered much more about his kind of emotional state, and he also the reading would spark new memories for him. So that was he and his wife Anne were really. I'm really grateful to both of them to have been able to do that. That was really important for me.
So just to follow up, you mentioned a bit about, when you read to him, it just kind of sparked some things about his emotional state. Would you say that that emotional state brought up trauma, or, what more could you say about the emotional state, please?
Yeah, good question. Not trauma, I would say, not for him. It was more that Richard is a very, as a lawyer, was a sharp, very serious, very, very dedicated person who didn't, in those interviews or in much else of his writing that I've read, betray a whole lot of emotion. He would talk about it, but it was fairly. He was not an emotional speaker. And I think towards the end of his life, I think especially as his memory started to get scattered, he was. I don't know whether this was him being more in touch with that side of himself or that side of his memories, but certainly more vocal about it, and was more demonstrative in his displays of emotion, and so that was where I had been intuiting emotion a lot, or his sort of mental state. I felt more comfortable writing about it if that was something that he talked about that seemed, and seemed reasonable after those interviews, because it's a delicate thing. But and because his memories were so scattered, the fact checking, utility of particularly about a year ago, I spent 2 very full days reading probably a third of the manuscript aloud to him. And there was kind of limited fact-checking utility in that. He couldn't necessarily remember everything that, but I had all the names and dates, right? I didn't need help with that. But it felt like, it helped me write him more fully as a person that readers could connect with, which I was grateful for. And also, I think he was able to live in those memories again as I was reading them to him. He was so, and he at the time he was having trouble, holding a train of thought. I mean, anybody who's known somebody with dementia knows what it does to your memory and sort of state of mind. And ability to hold on to a train of thought in a conversation. And he's um, and it felt like such but he was so like laser focused as I was reading to him, and that was really important for me, and I think important especially to sort of re-cement that relationship towards the end of my process with the book, just because I hadn't been in touch with him for so long.
So now let's go back to the main character, or one of the main characters of the book, Gary.
Yeah.
And it seemed as though, just reading about them, they had a really close-knit family. But what I found interesting was he was the baby of the family, and he noted, or it was noted in the book, that his family shielded him a lot from race relations. And I just remember one portion in the book where he just realized that he was Black, and that those things were actually happening to him, and to learn more about his family. So just give us a little bit more about Gary and his father, Lambert, and his involvement and all of that.
Yeah, Gary's family is, yeah, close knit's kind of an understatement. I mean, they are uh, boisterous, sort of a no holds barred kind of. I mean, super close. Since Katrina, they haven't all lived in the same stretch of land, but they did until Katrina. Basically, their houses were all kind of cheek by jowl lined up, and just really, um, there's so much love and trust there that you know. I remember the first time I went to a sort of Duncan family reunion, you know, and there was, man, like the tape of it is almost unintelligible. There's so much, I mean, people hollering over each other and all of this stuff, you know, people like talking over each other to tell me just how spoiled Gary was as a kid, you know, his brothers and sisters. And it just, but there was so much, we're like, you know, you know, I'm an odd dinner guest to have over at the Duncan house, and the fact that they were free to be completely themselves, I think speaks to the strength of that family, um, and to their strength of character and to their dedication to remaining themselves, right? And which is on display very much in the book in a totally different way, right? Because most people in Gary's situation would have just pled guilty to the misdemeanor and had it over with, right? Like this, you know, like $150 and you know, a little while in jail is not, you know, it's wrong, of course, but is it really worth fighting it? And taking the risks involved, and objectively somehow no, but that in that family, the idea of just lying down and taking it when something wrong has been done to you is totally anathema. And you know, that was part of, and Gary was sheltered from this too. You know, his parents and his elder siblings, who are as old as 16 years older than he is, all still living, by the way, his sibs. They he was too young for this, but before the Voting Rights Act, like 10 years before the Voting Rights Act, they would gather up at Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church, and they would smuggle civil rights workers down from New Orleans in the trunks of their cars, because the Black churches were the one place that the cops wouldn't try to break up an after hours meeting, because they just figured it was, you know, folks doing their thing, right? And no, they were studying how to beat the voter suppression measures that Perez had put in place. And it was hard work, and I won't go into the details because they're in the book. But I mean, really, sort of, you know, it would be comic if it weren't people's like real people's rights at stake. The links that Perez went to try to stop Black people from registering to vote, and Gary's elder siblings, the oldest, you know, two or three, you know, still carry their voter registration cards with dates before 1965 proudly, because that means they beat the constitutional interpretation test that was designed to keep them out. You know, at one time, something like 10 or 15% of all the registered Black people registered to vote, Black people in Plaquemines Parish, were named Duncan. I mean, this is a family that was incredibly dedicated, very savvy, under really severe circumstances, and just refused to um, refused to be cowed by that, and also insisted on taking joy in life. They were an incredibly joyful in family, and it's the story, I hope, covers their strength in the face of adversity, but also just the joyousness of being a Duncan, which is something I felt from the first moment I walked into that family reunion, and for the rest of the time I was working on the book. They're a really special group of people.
I got that as well. Just reading through and learning about their past and their family connections, but how close they were whenever they would go to New Orleans. And it just seemed like New Orleans was this place of freedom in a sense for them to go there. So give us just a little bit more insight about Lambert's relationship with New Orleans and the entire family.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things about Plaquemines Parish is that it is, on the one hand, one of the most isolated places in the United States. I mean, it is really just this ribbon of land sort of eked out from between the marshland and the Mississippi River, between the levees. There's only one road on each bank, right? There are no wrong turns to make once you get down the road. But you're still only an hour and a half from New Orleans, and especially once the bridge was built across the Mississippi, the connector. And so they were tied to the city in that way, much more than people in a place that's similarly isolated in most of the rest of the United States would feel. And so they went up there all the time because as members of a rural kind of isolated Black community, that's where they had a lot of relatives who lived up there, and there was such a vibrant community of Black and Black Creole folks up in New Orleans that they could very easily just go up and down the road and visit people, which gave them access to this really vibrant urban culture, and to things like music and just social clubs and whatnot. Gary ended up meeting his first wife up there, and she was from New Orleans, a Creole woman, could pass for white, who was from the Upper Ninth Ward, they divorced ages ago, but her brothers still live down in Plaquemines Parish. One of them is deacon at Gary's church, and there's a connection there, and there was a connection because of the fluidity with which people pass between New Orleans and Plaquemines Parish, which kept it from being as isolated as it really could have been. And at some point, Perez couldn't really do anything about it. And Perez too was connected to New Orleans, right? Particularly when the oil industry came in, Plaquemines became really integrated into the New Orleans metro area. So, New Orleans is a really important location in this story, and Plaquemines is very different from New Orleans, but it was important, and frankly, it was important because that's, but for having that city there, it's. Richard Sobol did work all over the state, particularly in the eastern half. But without New Orleans being so close, it's unlikely that Gary Duncan would have received the representation he received. And it's unlikely that his family would have thought to seek out a lawyer in New Orleans if he had lived in Tallulah or Shreveport or somewhere much farther away, where it was harder to get a hold of civil rights lawyers.
And I'm so glad that you brought out that point. One of our viewers mentioned, and I think this is a great point, and she said it's not a question, but she just wants to thank you because she remembers reviewing the Duncan versus Louisiana case when she was in law school. Mm-hmm. Although it's not widely known as Brown versus Board of Education, it is equally as important and significant. So she just wants to say kudos, and you did a magnificent job of shedding some light on this important change in American law. But so I want to get back to that, because it's not just about the Duncans or about Sobol, or it is about this system that this one seemingly small interaction was able to unfold. And I was amazed, and even reading it, like we knew something bigger. As you said, when you were reading it and you went down, you knew something bigger was there. But this bigger piece is what changed our entire way of doing things in America. And what I think is significant is that you were able to spend so much time, and as you say, 25,000 pages of interviews on this one area, but that's a microcosm of what was happening at the time across the country. So tell us how you were able to really bring it all together, because you really did a great job of taking where it began, but the impact. But how did you just like bring it all together?
Thank you, and thanks for those kind words. For me, I think there are a couple of things to say. The first is that, I sometimes joke that the story is a little bit of a bait and switch. You kind of come for the Supreme Court case and end up staying for the characters and the setting and the story. And also these other really important cases that were not in the U.S. Supreme Court, but were really impactful in the Deep South, having to do with lawsuits against Perez, both by Richard Sobol and by Gary Duncan, that set important precedents down there. So that's one thing to say, is that it's not just Duncan versus Louisiana. It's Duncan's progeny, as they say, all these other cases that came out of the situation because of the escalation of it. In terms of Duncan and in terms of its impact on the criminal legal system, I think it was both incredibly impactful in that so legally what Duncan versus Louisiana did was it applied the portion of the United States Constitution that refers to jury trials, criminal jury trials, to the states, and said all the states now need to offer jury trials, and those jury trials need to have some type of standardization, which had not been. All the states offered jury trials, but they didn't have to. And so Duncan was really important in that way, and most important because it laid the foundation for 50 years of really important jurisprudence about what constitutes a jury, including a case that the Supreme Court just decided this spring, Ramos versus Louisiana, which was about whether juries need to be unanimous or not. And so it's this foundational case that a lot of, frankly, I mean, I talked to a lot of lawyers, and a lot of lawyers don't remember it. Because the instant impact outside of Gary Duncan's life was fairly limited, but in the long term it was super important. I think the other thing to say about it is that what happened to Gary Duncan, it happened at the time for sure, but nothing that happened to Gary Duncan had anything really to do with Jim Crow. All of there's no mention of race in the simple battery statute in Louisiana. Misdemeanor battery is a crime in every state, still is. He was not an activist. He was not desegregating something actively. There was nothing illegal about making contact, between people of different races, except that, somebody testified that Gary hit the kid. And so actually every aspect of what happened to Gary is happening right now all over this country. And that was really what kept me going through the story, was that none of this, and really convinced me that I needed to write the book, and I needed to write it now, is that this is not about some case that, interesting as the story might be, is based on premises that no longer exist. Like everything that happened to Gary, it still can and does happen right now in Plaquemines Parish and elsewhere. As we are increasingly made aware of. And, so that to me is hopefully what readers take away from this, that aspects of this have to do with the civil rights movement and Jim Crow and the peculiarities of Plaquemines Parish in the 1960s, but a lot of it doesn't. A lot of it is stuff that happens all the time. And so, in terms of the story's like timelessness, or the or a cynic might say the way that history just kind of keeps repeating itself, right? That, people get jacked up on simple battery charges who shouldn't have been all the time, and frankly, a lot of them look like Gary Duncan, and for a lot of them, it's because there was a white person across the road who called the cops.
And that is, I think, the way that you were able to even talk about this case, but even the larger issues that were going on. Even at one point, and I know I'm going to say this name incorrectly, but Bogalusa.
Yep, you got it.
Hey.
Yeah.
So even in Bogalusa, and how that had an impact on the march, and how they were able to convince, leadership to provide some type of support, but Sobel was also working on those cases as well. And so, and how those cases also had a huge impact in during the civil rights movement. So talk a little bit more about those and how you
Yeah.
even started down that road.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, this is what I was saying about the process of the book, right? I started out because it seemed like this nice little, narrow, like 3 characters in a situation kind of story, right? That ends up at the Supreme Court. Everybody goes home happy, and then it didn't take long to look at Richard Sobol's body of work, and even just talking to him, I remember, because I listened to his interviews so many times, him telling me, like, listen, the whole thing about the Duncan case is that it was like 1% of my workload, maybe, even during the most intense times of working on it, because he was so busy doing all of this other really important stuff, including, I mean, particularly in Bogalusa, which was, I mean, ran the gamut, everything from parade laws, which were attempts to ban civil disobedience and demonstrations, to he helped an activist down there sue the Department of Housing and Urban Development, right? I mean, you name it. Bogalusa was like a Ku Klux Klan stronghold, and the location of a very highly organized, dedicated, brilliant, strategic, militant group of Black activists who worked their butts off, and Richard represented them for years. Including some of the first and most important cases under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which is employment discrimination, right? Issues that are still being litigated today. And so, but that was such a big portion of his work that I couldn't, in all honesty, write a book in which he was a character at this time and not spend time in Bogalusa. And there was a lot of time when I was reading all those court documents and looking at, talking to activists in Bogalusa, and where I was like, this is too much. I'm getting too far away from the story, but it all comes back together, right? Because all of these issues are enmeshed, and all of these issues are like, Gary didn't have anything to do with Bogalusa, but because of Richard Sobol and because of the struggle, it all had to do with, all of those things had to do with each other all the time. And so, I mean, it was painful editing all of that down from, I think my first draft was 850 pages into what it is now, which tells a much better story, if less complete. But I knew that the Bogalusa stuff needed to be in there because it is so important. And one of the things I want to do with this book, beyond just tell a really good story, is I was shocked that I'm not an academic historian of the civil rights movement, but I because just growing up Quaker and taking American history classes taught from an angle that was that focused on things like racial justice. From a young age, like, I've been more aware of the civil rights movement than I think most of my peers, and sort of the details of it, and outside of the mainstream of like what Martin Luther King did, which was important, but perhaps too dominant in our story about the civil rights movement. I'd never heard of this place. I'd never heard of this incredibly important, unique approach, which frankly looks more like the movement today than Martin Luther King's version of the movement does. Right? It was, I was. At some point, I was like, I've got to find a way to sneak in this history because it's too. I was upset that I'd never heard of this place, right? I never thought much about Louisiana in terms of the civil rights movement at all. Most people don't, but because it had its own path, and that path is really important, particularly since that era is passing out of living memory really quickly, and so people need to be documenting this, and I took my little corner of it, but if anybody else needs a book idea out there, just go to the Amistad Research Center at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana, and just look at stuff, because there are more stories than could fill a library of books.
And that's so funny because we have Heather asks, have you selected a topic for your next project?
I'm going to give a tricky answer. I'm working on a proposal right now, and that's local to me. Takes place in Detroit, and involves a bunch, sort of showdown between a bunch of working class, radical, anarchist, proto-punk music producer poets and rabble rousers facing off against the Nixon administration.
Because you make a reference to Nixon in this book and Ronald Reagan. So I think I mean, like how it's woven to the larger piece of American history. You just did a phenomenal job of bringing in all of those elements, but bringing it in enough for us to want to learn more, because I did find myself Googling a lot of things and saying, oh my gosh, okay,
Right.
like that makes sense. I get it.
Yeah.
So Bonnie just made a comment and just wanted to thank you for such an amazing story and for such great synchronicity. I think I'm saying that correctly. Those long words. And so thank you, Bonnie, so much for saying that. And we are at 7:30. What I know, right? I could go on and on, but I do want to ask you one last question. If we don't have any other questions here, what do you want readers to walk away from after reading this book?
Hmm. I hope that different readers will take different things from it. I mean, I think most important is, because there's a lot that I have to say about, the way what segregation was and what it wasn't, and all the other things that have mentioned about Bogalusa and the civil rights movement and whatnot. But I think the most important thing for me, for readers to come away with, is this is a really hopeful story in most of its aspects, and particularly the story of Richard Sobol and Gary Duncan. Right, because of Gary's really unreasonable dedication to sticking up for what was right, and Richard Sobol's legal savvy, and also Richard Sobol, and he was so good at this, and it mentioned it in his New York Times obituary, and I was really grateful for that. He worked in a supporting role always. He was never there to tell his clients what to do. He was there to support them and do what they needed, and to ask them what it was that they needed, never to tell them. And so that two people, right, two individuals with no backup really, were able to not just right a wrong that was done to Gary Duncan, but in doing so to pave the way for other people to right those same wrongs. And it is both constant work and it is hard work, and it does not pay very well. But at the same time, I think there's a lot to be learned from the way that they just doggedly stuck at it, knowing that they were right and knowing that they could win. And in doing so, produced not just the victory at the Supreme Court, but all of these other really important, lasting legal victories. And that's a thing that would not exist but for two people who were just really unreasonable about how much they did not want to see wrong done.
Ooh, I think that is so powerful. How we have to sometimes just be unreasonable about not wanting to see wrong done. We had a couple of questions that came in, so I do want to, we have just a little bit more time. I do want to address those. So Deb asks, did you get to talk to the boys in the story, and did they ever change?
Huh. I didn't, unfortunately. So sadly, so Wesley McKinney, one of them, left the parish very shortly after the incident. It's unclear why. There's speculation that because he was the one who testified initially in the police report that Gary did not hit Herman Landry. So there's some speculation he was run out of the parish. I don't know. I have not been able to track him down. No one has. But he basically disappears from the records. The Scarabian boys, unfortunately, both passed away. One of them died in Katrina at Port Eads at the mouth of the Mississippi, unfortunately. And I forget what happened to the other. Herman Landry is still alive. He was and it was easy to find. He's currently incarcerated, unfortunately, but wasn't interested in talking to me, and I don't know that I would have been interested in talking to me in those circumstances either.
Right. Okay, so thank you again. This is a really great book, and I would encourage all of you who are watching us to pick it up. And it's a page turner. It is. I could have, if I didn't need sleep, I would have read it in one setting. So thank you so much. We had one more comment come in. As a 72-year-old Miss Redden, as a 72-year-old white woman from the segregated South, I need to keep hearing these stories to challenge the truth I learned as a child. Thank you. And thank you. Thank you so much for bringing this to bear. And with that, unless you have anything else to say or you want to share with our participants, as they would say in the church, if there's nothing else to claim our attention, we could sign off.
Yeah.
Saying thank you so very much.
Yeah, thank you, Tamika. This is really I really appreciate your questions. I can't thank you enough for reading the book with that care, and asking such really interesting, provocative questions. I think I learned a lot just talking to you, having to put that into words. So I really appreciate it.
Well, the other secret is I have a law degree. And so I was fascinated because I was like, that is right. This is what happened.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
It's interesting to hear the stories behind the law, right? Because it didn't just get that way.
Yeah.
Something had to happen for it to get to that very level. And so thank you for giving us the background to understand how many of our laws are changed, because public policy will either create justice or perpetuate injustice. And so I think this book is a beautiful display of what happens when those policies create this system of injustice, but then what happens when you are unreasonably persistent to change. So thank you very much. We appreciate you. And we are signing off. Thank you, everybody, for watching. I do have instructions that I need to tell you about the Central Arkansas Library System and Six Bridges Book Festival. I need to let folks know that books are available for purchase at Wordsworth Books. So don't forget about Six Bridges. And if you want to go pick this book up, which I encourage you to pick the book up, you need to go to Wordsworth Books to pick it up. Thank you again, Matthew, and thank you everybody for watching.
Thanks everyone.